Hello and welcome. This is Red Vitus here with another watch repair video. This is a watch that I purchased at auction. It's an Illinois watch company, Bunn special. And let's take a look and admire this watch before I open it up and clean it. And what I like about this dial mainly is the script on that Illinois watch company. That I guess it's a Gothic or Old English style script. I think that's really a signature of this model. Plus, instead of Arabic, you have Roman numerals, which in the late 1800s were still being used in railroad grade pocket watches. Pretty good motion on the balance. And watches of this era didn't have as much written on the movements. While we see the word adjusted there, it doesn't indicate how many adjustments were made. Also, what I find peculiar is that it lists the city where it was made. The movement doesn't have the watch company anywhere on it. Lastly, that fish scale damascening is a great touch. It's wonderfully done, and it's used everywhere, even around the balance jewels on the balance cock. And so I think a good cleaning and that pattern will really pop. And now we look at the performance of this watch, at least before service, on the Timegrapher. And I'd say it looks pretty amazing, given that I purchased this watch without any indication of whether or not it ran, and certainly no disclosures about its service history. So we see that the watch has a good amplitude, above 270 and even approaching 300. That's not necessarily the correct amplitude. I haven't measured the lift angle yet, and at 52 degrees, which is the default setting, it's probably not the correct lift angle for the watch. With the pendant down, I start to see some variation in the timing. And I believe this watch was adjusted in 6 positions when it originally left the factory. However, the pendant down position is not one that the watch would normally be carried in, so it's not too critical. But in pendant right, we also see a similar variation. There is some metal debris on the jewels, as well as a complete lack of any signs of oil, indicating that it may be time to clean this watch. And I'll begin the service now. First task is to remove the hands. And I'll just set the hands together. This is a lever set watch. So once the hands are moved together, I just prefer to do it that way and remove the hands as a set, the hour and the minute hand. Now these hands really resisted coming off. I was able to pull them up with levers, but then they got stuck at the end. So I used this other tool, which rather clumsily got them off. And I go ahead and remove the seconds hands with levers. This watch, as you can see, has a screwback case. I don't know if this was the original case for the watch, but it doesn't appear that this case was ever holding any other movements based on the screw indentations on the back. So to remove the watch, there are these half-head type screws, which make it easy to case and decase the watch. They do have one issue in that they tend to cut into the case back, and so I do prefer the full head case screws. And to remove this dust cover, I use a screwdriver. And here's how I remove the balance. Now I separate the balance cock from the balance wheel. And I do that because I'm going to have to clean the jewels, and in order to access the jewels, I'm going to need to remove the balance wheel from the cock anyway. And I just find it easier to remove it here. Now, taking your time on this step, I think, is the most critical part. Now, with the balance cock removed, I look at one of the things I look for is the serial number, and just check that they match the serial number on the back of the movement, and it does. And with the balance bridge off, the balance comes off easy. Now I loosen the 3 dial screws, which allow me to remove the dial. Taking care after removing the dial to retighten these screws so that they don't come loose and fall off the movement in the cleaners. And I put this dial in a safe place. And I begin removing the parts from the pillar plate. And there's a series of wheels, levers, gears, springs that all come off. I'd let this watch wind down before starting the work. Here I'm just pressing the click to verify that. You can either move the click from the top, or they give you access on the side. Now this screw wouldn't budge, so I decided to hold off on that and try it again later. Some screws are more prone to either crack, or the heads can separate from the threaded part. So if I do have a stubborn screw, I'll use a penetrating oil. And it's not uncommon to find 1 or 2 stubborn screws in an old watch. This is the first of several springs that I'm going to remove. My technique for doing this is to partially unscrew the spring. Now here I actually remove the screw and then put it back in a little bit. But once I have the screw sort of partially undone, then I can release the tension on the spring, and then hopefully remove the spring all the way without any surprises. So now the tension is removed, I can completely unscrew and remove it. This watch, I think I mentioned, was from the 1890s. This was an era when American watchmaking was at or near its peak in terms of production and, I think, status. This is a really nicely decorated movement. Lovely pattern all over. A watch of this grade, they go the extra mile in some of the decorative areas, like this ratchet wheel cover. Which almost looks like it's if it weren't for the screws, you wouldn't know that ratchet wheel cover was a separate part. It just blends in so well. And once removed, I can separate the ratchet wheel. It had a lot of oil on it, at least on one side. And this again, along with the with that strange debris on the jewel, kind of led me to think that this watch may have been given a bath at some point. So here I'm removing the barrel bridge. As my foray into the gear train. So underneath you'll see the barrel, which is also holds a wheel, as well as provides the power for the spring. These watches were designed so that the barrel could be removed without fully disassembling the watch, which facilitated servicing the watch. These springs in old watches were high carbon steel. Over time, they tended to either lose their strength or often would become brittle and crack and break, and just had to be replaced. Now as I lift off this train bridge, that will reveal the rest of the gear train. Really admiring these real ruby jewels. Now this is the pallet fork. And next, the steel escape wheel. Now the fourth wheel, which serves double duty in that it is part of the gear train, but it also holds or it has the post for the seconds hand. And this is the center wheel, or second wheel. And the third wheel. Now there's one other part on this side that I want to remove, and that is the winding pinion. And it's housed inside of its bearing, which is a two-piece bearing. This type of design I've seen in many of the American-made pocket watches of this era, the 18 size pocket watches. There are 3 screws here. So gloved fingers I found work well in freeing those plates from the bridge. So here you can see how one piece is keyed into the other, and I found that by wedging a screwdriver in between the pinion and the plate, that started to separate, and then took it the rest of the way, because it only moves in one direction, or only slides in one direction. The pinion as well can only be removed one way. And there's the disassembled parts. Now these last 2 screws were soaked in penetrating oil, and now they're much easier to unscrew. This is the setting lever, or the setting lever screw. Now I'm removing this right-handed screw. But now even after I've removed the screw, it's difficult to loosen this plate. So there's a cover piece, or some type of bearing, which is friction fit and holds that plate down. So don't be tempted to wedge a screwdriver in. That's a highly polished piece, and you'll likely scratch it. Illinois gives you a hole in the plate, and I was able to push that that bearing out from the back, and now you can see it pretty safely removed, I think, with no harm to the polished finish. And now this lower plate is easy to remove. And that just leaves a couple more setting and winding wheels that have to come off before this watch goes into the cleaner. There is one cosmetic issue to deal with. Here on the minute hand, someone has used an abrasive and removed the bluing near the tip of the hand and just left it that way. So I'm going to refinish and blue this hand. That should revive the color as well as remove some of those rust spots. I'm using here a piece of balsa wood, which I've impregnated with a polishing compound. It does a nice job at taking off some surface rust. It won't remove any deep pitting, but it will improve the appearance of the surface. Okay, now I'm bluing the hand over an alcohol lamp. And as the steel is heated, it'll change color. First, it'll darken and give turn to a straw color, which is sort of a dark yellow. It'll continue to darken and go through a purple and then to a blue. And I want to continue heating, moving the flame from one side to the other until the entire hand is a uniform shade of blue and matches the hour hand. Here's the finished minute hand next to the hour hand, which I haven't restored yet. I do one hand at a time so that I can ensure as much as possible that the color is uniform. And now I can begin reassembly, starting with the winding pinion. Now attaching the winding pinion to the plate, there are 2 feet which line it up. For most watches, the escape wheel and other wheels are installed in the pillar plate. However, for full plate watches, I find installing them into the top plate and then placing the pillar plate on top is easier for me to do. I'm watching the jewel with a loop and lining up the pivot so it just sets right down. Okay, next comes the pillar plate on top. The difficulty of this is that I have 5 pivots now to line up. I don't have to line them all up all at once. I try and fit the center one first, then the 4th wheel, and then the 3rd wheel. So there I've gotten all 3 of those at once. Now I can work on the escape wheel and pallet fork. And I just want to nudge them into place, never putting any pressure on the pillar plate. I just allow the pieces to find their jewel and fall into position. Just giving whatever, or just taking whatever it gives me. And they're all in. I need to inspect the jewels to make sure I can see the pivots. And to fasten the screws, I will now flip over the movement, giving my nerves a chance to rest. And I set this now on a movement holder, which makes it easier for me to film. And apply the 2 bridge screws. I don't want to tighten these screws down all the way because I want to do some checks to be sure that all the wheels are in position. And the test is to confirm that the pallet fork snaps to the side when I put pressure on the center wheel. There it happened. I'm going to show that again in slow motion. Well, I hope you can see that. The movement is not that much, and I repeat that several times in both directions to make sure I'm happy before tightening the screws. Now I install the mainspring. Now this is a new mainspring, and it's actually weaker than the recommended mainspring for this model. It's 2/100ths of a millimeter thinner, and according to de Carlisle, the strength of a mainspring is proportional to its thickness to the 3rd power, which essentially means that this spring is 70% of the strength of the recommended spring. I decided to go for that. It's a little bit of an experiment, a little bit of a test, because the old spring that was there was completely set and still giving a strong amplitude. So I didn't want to go with a full strength recommended mainspring. And there you can see, I think that the bridle is lined up with the hole. Now I oil this arbor before placing it in. There is no oil on the mainspring. It is a self-lubricating spring according to the packaging. Now I'm working on the pillar plate and installing the motion works. This is the winding wheel. Placing some HP 1300 on this part. I assemble this plate up and the wheels upside down. Like the wheels on the movement, I find that this is an easier way of doing it. Now I rotate the wheels a little bit. That spreads the oil so that when I flip this part over, the wheels don't fall off. And I set it in the movement nice and easy. Now this is the friction fit bearing, which I want to press in, but while holding the movement up off of the movement holder so that the plates aren't squeezed together. Now that it's in, I can screw it down. I place a little bit of grease where the setting lever contacts. While I do show some of the oiling and lubrication, I do not show all of the steps. Place a drop of oil on that setting lever for the screw. And the spring goes on pretty much the exact opposite way I took it off. That is to partially screw in and then set the spring into position to tension the part, and then screw it in fully. Now I'm oiling that center jewel with HP 1300 and that center pivot for the canyon pinion. Here I'm using HP 1300 for the larger, slower moving wheels, and for the faster wheels like the escape wheel and balance, I use Mobius 9020. This is the ratchet wheel. The ratchet wheel cover. It has two screws, and these are not interchangeable. One is a little bit longer than the other. Here comes the click. And once I install the click spring here, I can give it a little bit of a wind. Next, to reinstall the balance, I set the impulse jewel past the pallet fork and rotate the movement, not the balance bridge, when I install it. I think it wants to run, but it just needs to be lined up. Not yet. And there we're off. Now I give it a full wind and let it run overnight to test. Now you can see the jewels are clean and visible signs of an oil bubble in the balance jewel. And it's running great. I can finish the assembly with the minute wheel. And here's the hour wheel and dial washer. Placing that now cleaned dial and fastening the dial screws. The dust cover goes on before casing. So now that it's cased, I'll install the hands next and set the time. Here's the hour hand, which will be followed by the minute hand, and lastly the second hand. Let's put this watch on the timer. Looking at the Timegrapher, I've set the time to about 10 seconds fast, a little bit above. Quite a healthy amplitude. That's not the correct amplitude. I haven't set the lift angle yet. I will check for that later, but I wanted to be able to compare this with the starting measurements, and there is a pretty big improvement of about 40 degrees amplitude. Now checking in the vertical, also looks like good timing. And here's the finished watch. Sure looks lovely. Very happy with how the dial and hands turned out. Looking back at this repair, probably what I'm most proud of is the selection of the mainspring. I think if I had gone with the recommended spring, it would have been too powerful. So going with one that was a little bit thinner seemed to pay off. If I could have done this over again, what I might have done differently would be to assemble the parts of the winding and setting works first before installing the train wheels. I think that would have been easier, but it worked out okay. So again, this is Red Vitus. I'd like to thank everyone for visiting my channel. I'd like to point you to my Instagram page where I'll be posting my next project soon. Also want to thank all those who visit my channel, view the videos, and leave comments, and especially the subscribers of the Red Vitus channel. Thank you, and I hope to see you again.